Hello everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to Environmental Health Australia's webinar to celebrate Australian Food Safety Week 2024. I'm Glenys Nichols, I'm an EHO based in Latrobe in not so sunny Tassie today, and I'm on the National Board as a director there, so welcome everybody. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which we are meeting today and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. With some housekeeping, please note that this webinar will be recorded. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute. And if you'd like to ask questions while the presentation is underway, please put something in the chat box and we'll go back to that later. There'll be 5 minutes for questions at the end of each presentation. For those of you who are unsure about what environmental health is, simply put, environmental health is protecting people from hazards in their environment. Environmental health officers work to protect their communities from concerns like food safety, noise pollution, air quality, diseases, and so much more. This year's theme for Australian Food Safety Week is Look Before You Cook, reading food labels, with a focus on following the food safety instructions on packaged foods, labels such as use by or best before dates, as well as cooking and storage instructions. To showcase the diversity of environmental health and the work that EHOs do, today we'll be hearing from two fantastic environmental health professionals. Our first speaker today is Linda Buchtmann. Linda is the CEO of the health promotion charity, the Food Safety Information Council. From 1997 to 2010, she headed the communication and stakeholder engagement section for the government regulator Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, or FSANZ. At FSANZ, she worked on complex issues such as food labelling, consumer concerns about chemicals in food and genetically modified food, as well as major food emergencies such as the melamine milk contamination in China. Welcome, Lydia.
Yes, and thanks for that. And yes, I'm talking to you from Ngunnawal land in Canberra today. So thanks for this opportunity to talk about Food Safety Week. If my voice goes, it's because I've been doing media solid for about 10 days. Just a little bit about us. We're actually a health promotion charity founded back in 1997, and our role is to educate the Australian community in safe food handling. We use an evidence base, that's both scientific evidence and social research. And there are a whole range of members, including EHA, we're pleased to have you along, CSIRO, FSANZ, nearly all states and territories apart from Victoria, which I keep pointing out. This is our major gig of the year, Australian Food Safety Week, but throughout the year we do smaller campaigns. We do hand washing, parasites recently, and we seem to be the expert on poisonous mushrooms. So there's lots of teachable moments about that at the moment. So we aim to reduce the 4.67 million cases of food poisoning a year. It's a big strain on the health system, as you can see, and it's a big cost on the health system. And it's such a preventable thing to do, as most people know as EHOs here. So moving on to the next one. At our planning day with all the states and territories and all our other members, we looked at the theme of looking at food labels this year, the food safety instructions on food labels, so not the nutrition panels and allergens, but particularly the food safety side, where cooking, storage, date marking, and those things that might stop foodborne diseases and stuff. This was picked up mainly because there's been some sporadic cases of food poisoning linked to air fryers. Initially, no one quite knew what it was about. It wasn't like a normal outbreak. It wasn't linked to a specific food or a specific restaurant. But they just happened all around the country. And eventually, the good old food detectives, and well done EHOs, and the states and territories found out there were people not cooking things correctly in air fryers. Air fryers use hot air, and they're a little bit hotter than ovens. So things like schnitzels and parmigiana might look cooked on the outside, but they're not on the inside, hence the risk of foodborne disease there. Interestingly, we thought we'd go out and actually test with the consumers and see what they thought what they did read off of food labels. So a third of consumers say they always read cooking and storage instructions, which we thought was quite good compared with some of the research we've done. Only 6 in 10 always read use by dates, which is a little bit of a worry because I don't quite know when that food will expire. And 5 in 10 always read best before dates, so slightly less on that one. The good news, though, that there have been quite a lot of improvement over the last 10 years or so since we last did this survey. So it's gone up a couple of percent for people who always read use by dates and comply with them. Best before dates, still about the same, 83% looking both at them and complying with them. 66% read storage instructions and 83% comply. And we assume that's because they think, well, the milk, needs to go in the fridge. I don't need to look every time. And 69% read cooking instructions and 74% comply. So this is a considerable improvement, so 90% increase overall in reading cooking instructions and a 17% increase in complying with them. But like all health promotion campaigns, it takes a long time. You think, it took 30 years for smoking to kick in. So it's one of those long, hard slogs we have to do. So, well, we then looked at the air fryers, wondering if I had a theory, as did our market researcher Omnipol, that people have air fryers, but may not necessarily use them. But look, 2 in 3 Aussies have one in their household. And they don't just keep them in the kitchen cupboard along with all the other weird appliances they bought over the years. 54% use these air fryers weekly and 38% several times a week. And we recognise that they are convenient, they're easy to use, and obviously very, very popular. We then looked to see if people could actually find cooking instructions on crumbed packaged food. As you'll notice, there's, normally stovetop or oven instructions or even in a microwave, but it's very reasonably rare to see them. But 44% said they were starting to see it on the crumbed packaged foods. Another 44% only found them occasionally on crumbed packaged foods. So we're trying to encourage manufacturers to include these instructions, particularly on those high-risk foods that have, where there is meat or chicken inside. So our messaging for Food Safety Week is firstly to look at, if all else fails, read the instructions. Look at the instructions that come with your air fryer. That includes how to cook different products. Look out for that packaging instructions if you can find it. But as we always say, however you're cooking the food, with the high-risk foods, like formed meat, for chicken, for minced products, always use a meat thermometer and cook those high-risk foods to 75 degrees Celsius. And we have a whole list of cooking temperatures, safe cooking temperatures on our website. One interesting thing, in a year or so ago, we actually changed our advice to say it was unsafe to eat rare steak. I've had a few complaints about that, but if people want to take the risk, they can. But that's for parasites as well as food poisoning. We're telling people to eat them medium rare, and it's another reason to use a meat thermometer because your steak will turn out perfectly, we hope. So here's thanks to our major sponsor Neogen, who's reworked a lot of our material that we can use online. This is generally some advice on where to find those food labels. And these ones on the cooking temperatures and how to use your meat thermometer. We don't mind if you just use a cheap meat thermometer at home, or you can go out and find a fancy digital one somewhere too, with Bluetooth and an app. Okay, so the campaign kicked off at the beginning of this month. We'll be running our TV and community service announcement all right through to the end of January. This is where charities like ourselves are good, because we get these community service announcements run for free by the TV stations, which is great, and the radio stations too. Whereas if you're a government doing this, you wouldn't get much change from many millions of dollars. So we're also running, just to go back to that, radio ones, and including an Indigenous one, Nornie I believe her name is a Miriam woman who runs a restaurant and Indigenous foods in her restaurant in Melbourne, and she's getting messages out there through National Indigenous Radio Service. And our radio ones go out on community radio and also commercial radio around the country. So, and we've done a lot of media on this one too. Here's just another bit of research we did last month for Global Hand Washing Day, and thanks to our member Accord who funded this. We got a lot of coverage for this too, not least because we had a slight go at men, which is not nowadays it is fair, let's face it. Men's reported behaviour is a lot lower than women's. Young people are less likely to wash their hands regularly after going to the toilet before handling food. Older people are better. Country people, people living in rural areas are better than city people, we think, because they're more exposed to, animals and poop and know how risky things can be. So once people get a little bit older, their hand washing improves, probably because they start to have kids and they start to get more focused on cleanliness, or possibly they just get a bit more sensible in middle age. But this is interesting. The youngest group of 18 to 24-year-olds performed better in always washing hands after going to the toilet than the next oldest group of under 34. We're not quite sure this is happening, whether this is the COVID generation where it sort of kicked in, or whether the new food safety standards, which require more training for food handlers, and a lot of young people start out, jobs or earning a bit of money as students by working in food handling. So there is gradual improvement on hand washing, but there was a spike during COVID, but not as high as we'd hoped it would be. And people have gone down a couple of percentage points too. So, but we'll keep an eye on that hand washing, and we will keep criticising blokes if they don't wash their hands as well as women over the years. Helps us get good media, if nothing else. So we're delighted to be working with EHA over the years. And if you're interested as an environmental health officer, a number of councils are members to us. That gives you access to all of our full research data that's useful. We're grateful how everyone promotes Food Safety Week. We've got a whole package on our website on how you can do things for Food Safety Week, including media releases and quizzes and all sorts of stuff. And we've moved over the years away from just looking at consumers, but we move into some of those grey areas that are more food businesses, such as farmers markets, stopping illegal sales of food on Facebook, which isn't working very well, school canteen training, and when there's things like fundraising. So, and we're also looking to encourage more people to do food safety courses, regardless of whether they're a food business or whether they're just a consumer. And that's getting more easier with more online ones. So, yeah, just to finish up, we'd like to thank our member Neogen, who was gold sponsor for Australian Food Safety Week and our summer campaign, and also South Australian Health, who supported the consumer research, and NT Health, which has funded our Indigenous campaign. So we can't do it without funding. So anyone's interested in either becoming a member or finding us funding resources. We used to have federal funding, but we don't anymore. So we'll be having a chat to the federal government before the upcoming elections. So anyway, thank you, everybody. That's all I had to say at the moment. And there's contact details if you want to see what's happening with Food Safety Week.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Lydia. That was really interesting. Particularly interested in the air fryer research. So yeah, keeping an eye out for that and see how that progresses, and also the hand washing data. That's always really interesting as to what comes up with that. All right. So we're now opening up for any questions. So we have 5 minutes for questions. So do we have any questions? No. Oh, actually, there might be one. UK Food Standards Agency in 2022 reports 2.4 million cases of foodborne illness occur every year in the UK. Population approximately 70 million people. The UK also have seen an increase of 1.4 million cases from 2009. Not sure we're comparing apples with apples that exactly fit with Australian case definitions used in our reporting. But given that Australia experiences this large burden of illness reported in 2022 of 4.67 million cases, a proportion of the population, this will seem a lot higher than the UK. Are we seeing this similar increase of cases over the last decade or so in Australia? And what do you think could be the drivers of this greater proportion of cases experienced in the Australian context compared to the UK? That's from James.
And yes, how long do we have? This is Food Standards Australia and New Zealand studies, and it's a little bit hard to judge whether it's gone up or down over the years because there's been slightly different methodology as such. But what is interesting with the overall cost in billions is it looks at disability available life years. So it's a little like COVID. It's not just cost of the odd hospitalisation. It's also looking at long-term disabilities and reactions to food poisoning, because people forget it is serious. You can end up with reactive arthritis. You can end up having to give up work even. If you get it really bad. And of course, in the worst case scenario, you can actually die from foodborne disease, as you know. But it's probably something you can ask for DANS more than us, but I don't think those numbers are directly comparable as such. But we seem to be on par with most westernized countries. So I'm not quite sure how America's going to go with the new government coming in. We'll have to see what's happened to the poor old FDA there.
Is there a higher risk in cooking raw meat in an air fryer over crumbed or frozen products?
It's a good question. Now, most of the mention of foodborne illness has been linked to the crumbed products. But I'd say there's also a risk in raw meat. I've seen recipes where people are putting, chicken drumsticks and cooking them in there too. I think with any new type bit of tech, it's a bit different. And certainly looking at the instruction manuals for air fryers, I've had to borrow friends once because I don't have one myself. They certainly give advice on cooking high-risk products like meat itself in the air fryers to follow those instructions. Yeah, like anything, I'd say, yeah, it's also a risk, any high-risk product like that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So that's all the questions. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time, Lydia. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. So now we'll be speaking with Catherine McAuley. Catherine obtained a Bachelor of Agricultural Science at the University of Melbourne and has worked at the Food Research Complex in Werribee, Victoria, in what is now part of the CSIRO for over 30 years. Thank you for joining us today, Cathy. It's great to have you for Australian Food Safety Week webinar.
That is working?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bunurong and Wadurong people as the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting on today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also extend that to the lands that you're currently meeting on as well. So I'll be talking about look before you cook and eat, and can that bad spot on your food really be cut off? So yes, so Dr. Catherine McAuley, I have a PhD in dairy microbiology from the University of Melbourne. I have experience in pilot plant food manufacture as I became a cheesemaker for part of my research, and I've been a food microbiologist for over 25 years. And I'm working at CSIRO, so there's more than 6,400 staff nationwide, as well as a handful of staff overseas. I'm in the Agriculture and Food Research Unit, which has about 800 staff and 85 staff in the food program. So I'll be talking about food waste and a little bit of the background interest, mold versus bacteria, the growth, where and when, the risks, and of course, different foods have different risks. So the issue of food waste has come to light in the last decade in Australia. The various sectors have different proportions of food waste. So in wholesale and retail, it's actually only about 7%. 22% of food is wasted on farm in primary to production, but 32% of food is wasted in the household. Now, part of this will be, the difference between people getting confused with the use by and best before dates, where, the best before dates are, as you know, just guidelines, whereas the food is still good after it, but sometimes people get a little bit concerned and throw it out just in case. Whereas the use by dates really are a food safety guideline where you want to adhere to those dates. So then everyone can have, food in their fridge that but you might have bought a bit more than what you needed, or you've stuff you've just forgotten about, or you've gone out and had a dinner and forgot to cook something, and then you think, oh, can I really use that food anymore? And well, yeah, it depends on what the food is. And there's been media reports in recent times on whether or not it is safe to cut mold off food. So I'll be discussing that. So food spoilage, it's caused by both bacteria and fungi. So not all spoilage is harmful, might just be unpleasant. So bacteria and fungi, they each have their niches, which I'll talk about. But the fungi, the molds, they're more visible. So they reproduce by cells, and these cells form in a line in a hyphae. And then the hyphaes clump together to form a mycelium. And then if there's enough of them, then that becomes visible, and then you can actually see it. So factors that affect growth. So bacteria and fungi, they're different. So bacteria actually have a very wide temperature range. They can grow from 2 degrees up until over 70 degrees, or even higher if they're an extremophile. Whereas fungi are much more limited, where they might only grow between, say, 5 degrees and 35 degrees. Then pH, so the acidity of a product. Bacteria are a bit more limited in their pH growth range, whereas fungi, they can grow from pH 2 up to pH 9. So that's fairly wide. And of course, it does depend on the species as well. And the water activity of the food, that's the free water that's available for growth. That varies between bacteria and fungi. And again, fungi can grow at a slightly lower water activity than bacteria. So bacteria, you use a water activity of 0.85, for safety, but fungi can actually grow at 0.79 or 0.8 water activity. That, of course, also depends on the species. And then the gaseous atmosphere, whether or not there's oxygen or no oxygen or a combination of both, depends. So bacteria can grow in all sorts of atmospheres, just depends on their species and what they're able to do. Whereas fungi, they're pretty much only aerobic. So if you take the oxygen out, then you're not going to have fungal growth. So this presentation is more focused on molds, because that tends to be what we see on the food. So where do we encounter molds? Well, they can be in higher sugar foods. So the sugar in food will reduce the water activity. So it might prevent some of the bacteria from growing, but molds might still be able to grow, such as in jams. And the molds they can grow in slightly lower moisture foods than bacteria. Of course, they like the moisture, they like the water. If there's more moisture, then they'll grow better. But they can grow in lower water foods compared to bacteria, and also grow at a lower pH than bacteria. Of course, with all of these things combined, that can then exclude the bacteria from growing. So then if the bacteria can't grow, then the fungi have less competition, and then they might be able to grow better. So not all molds are bad. I mean, we do use molds in food production. The ones that we tend to think of would be, say, camembert cheese or blue cheese. It could also be used on the surface of dry sausages. And so then if they're on the surface, then they can potentially prevent microbial growth. However, all of these fungi would be used in food production, they've been assessed for safety. So you just don't use any old mold for what you're doing. What's the risk? Well, when mold grow, they produce these invisible hyphae that extend to whatever they're growing into. And at the tips of the hyphae, they can release enzymes to degrade complex molecules into the nutrients that they can use. But they can also release mycotoxins. So the mycotoxins are released at the ends of the hyphae. And the mycotoxins are not, they're not eliminated by cooking. So mycotoxins, not all of them are bad. Some of them are used in the food industry, like natamycin, which can be used in the dairy industry to control the growth of other yeast and mold. Some have medicinal uses, like antibiotics. Where would we be without antibiotics? But again, antibiotics are used at prescribed levels. If you have not enough, then you don't kill the bacteria. If you have too much, then you make the patient sick, because they are, after all, poisons. And then some mycotoxins can be harmful. You don't necessarily have an immediate effect from consuming a food that's contaminated with mycotoxins, but through repeated ingestion over time, they can cause, say, kidney, liver, and immune system damage, and they can potentially cause different cancers and neurological symptoms. And not all the molds on food will produce mycotoxins or produce them at levels that are harmful. But without a microscope in the lab and chemical characterization, you can't really tell just by looking at it if it's a dangerous mold or if it's a harmless one. So of course, we always want to err on the side of caution. And just if there is a mold growing on food, we'll assume that it's something that can hurt us, even if perhaps it can't. Unless of course, it's like camembert. So can you cut the bad spot off? Well, in soft and liquid and viscous foods, such as jams, soft cheeses, and sauces, and tomato paste. No, you can't, because because the food is soft, the hyphae will be able to extend into the food, and where the hyphae extend, the toxins extend. So therefore, that whole food can be considered to be potentially contaminated by toxins that may or may not harm you, but you don't want to take that risk. Similarly, with porous foods such as bread, soft fruit, and soft vegetables, the hyphae can still extend into those foods. And again, where the hyphae can extend, then the toxins can extend. So then they could potentially still harm you. So in hard foods, like hard cheeses or dense vegetables, can you cut the bad spot off? Well, potentially yes, if you can cut 1 to 2 centimeters away, because because the food is really hard, the hyphae can't extend into the food very easily. Of course, it also depends on the age of the food. If the mold's only been there for a few days or something, then it's probably fine. But if you've had the mold in there for, say, a few weeks, well, maybe you might want to think about it. So in summary, the risks versus benefits. So in times of, high food waste and, increased cost of living, we don't necessarily want to throw out food. And do you really want to throw out that piece of expensive cheese? Maybe not. Not all mold is harmful, but it's hard to tell what the mold is without analytical techniques. And the risk of long-term health effects, if it is harmful, do you really want to take that chance? So liquid and soft food is a higher risk. So you really don't want to be consuming those if they have signs of mold. But hard foods can potentially be saved. You can cut 1 to 2 centimeters off. But then there's always the old saying, if you're concerned, if in doubt, throw it out. Thank you. There's my contact details there. Any questions?
Okay, let's see. So there's a question. So why the change to not recommend rare steak? I think Lydia had been speaking about that.
Yes, just to jump back to that, there's an increasing amount of parasites in our food, and we're regretting taking on a Professor Shikufe Shamsi, who's a brilliant parasitologist, but she's very frightening. But yeah, it's not sufficient to really kill food poisoning bacteria or to kill parasites, hence the wish to move away from that, because we think that is far too risky general, and it will reduce foodborne disease. And really a medium rare steak, according to most gourmet people, is just as delicious. Just being particularly cautious.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. So I see a lot of best before dates on meat products in the fridge section at the supermarket. If I were to eat those products well past the BB date, would I still be at risk of food poisoning? So Catherine, is that one that you can answer for us?
Well, personally, if it's getting towards the use by date, I would stick it in the freezer, because that will stop the microbial growth. And then there's always the sniff test, and then there's whether or not, if it smells off, then you don't want to eat it, even if it's before the use by date. After the use by date, well, then obviously you'd have to make sure you cooked it. But then there's always the potential problem of toxins that are not going to be killed by heating. So that comes back to that old saying where, if you're concerned about it, then you throw it out.
And just to jump back to that too, because the supermarkets are moving, certainly back in my food standards days when we were developing the labelling, the intent that was very little food would actually have a use-by date on it, simply because you didn't want to waste food. But it has been used, for things like pasteurized milk, more and more, and that's also for quality as well as food safety, because no one wants to drink milk if it's off, even though it may not be too bad for you. So the supermarkets are putting best before dates so they don't legally have to drag it off the shelves immediately and not use it. So it's a food waste issue. And normally if it's cooked, it is okay. But yeah, we keep stressing, your freezer is your friend, pop it in the freezer if it's getting near the... And people could buy things up quickly before they're used by or best before date. If they do that, you can actually freeze that food. You don't have to rush and use it straight away and still get a good bargain there.
Excellent. All right, thanks, Lydia. The next question, how can we control the risk of listeria on chicken or soft cheeses, etc.?
I mean, we do a lot of advice on listeria. It is, one of the most dangerous forms of foodborne disease, particularly for people, pregnant people, the frail elderly. Humorously, as we all get older, we keep thinking it's all right for us to keep eating camembert. But certainly if you've got immune problems, it really can be risky. So it's obviously manufacturers do their best to try and avoid the risk, but it can happen. And really that advice still is, if you're in a high risk immunocompromised group, you shouldn't be eating listeria risky foods, which is a bit of a shame because I like camembert.
Yes. Thanks, Lydia. Catherine,
Actually,
did you have anything to make comment about that one?
I do actually, because of my experience with dairy. Now, obviously, as the cheese is maturing, the mold on the outside is it's alkaline, so the cheese starts off as acidic, and as the cheese matures, the alkaline production from the mold on the outside makes the cheese less acidic in the middle. So then that means that it becomes riskier as it matures.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Catherine. So another question. What is your recommendation with thawing meats and placing them back into the freezer? Could that have any effect on bacteria growth and the safety of food? Catherine, did you want to answer that one for us?
Sure, yes. Yes, Catherine Moyer at CSIRO has previously written something about that actually. So it's, if you've thawed it, it depends how long it's been thawed for. If you've had it thawed and it's been a couple of days, well then that's then the things could continue to grow over that time. But if you thawed it for 10 minutes and stuck it back in the freezer, then that would be okay, because you're not really giving the bacteria time to start growing again.
Yeah, and I guess if you've thawed it in the fridge and then decided, oh no, you're not going to eat it, and just popped it straight back in the freezer, it's the actual taste may have degraded, I guess, but not necessarily the food safety.
Yeah, so it's whole length of time that's at the not optimum condition.
We agree. It's a common question. We get a lot of phone calls around dinner time, particularly people with teenagers, you know, where they've defrosted everything and none of the kids have turned up for dinner. But yeah, you're right. You can put it straight back in. Your other option is, if it's been out, you can actually cook it into something and then refreeze a meal and take it for lunch or work the next day. But we certainly don't recommend leaving it too long in the fridge, and make sure your fridge is running at 5 degrees or below. That's something we like people to check with a fridge thermometer too.
Yeah. All right, great advice. Okay, did we have any other questions? Okay, so Catherine, I don't think I formally thanked you for your presentation. It was really interesting, and I think some great advice for us. So yeah, thank you so much. So that concludes our Australian Food Safety Week webinar for 2024. I hope everyone enjoyed the event as much as I did, and maybe even learnt something new. Can always learn something new, I think. I want to take this opportunity to thank again both our fantastic speakers for taking the time to be part of today's webinar and to share their knowledge and experience with everyone. So a recording of the webinar will be available to EHA members soon. And lastly, if you'd like more information on environmental health, EHOs or EHA, visit the Environmental Health Australia website. And I think they will have a link that will pop up on that. So thank you so much to everyone, and have a great Australian Food Safety Week. Thank you.